Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our November Carolina Mental Health Seminar. We will plan to get started in just a minute or two as folks are trickling into the room. So if you've just joined us, give us just a few moments and we'll be back to kick off the seminar. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our Carolina Mental Health Seminar. We'll give folks one more minute to join the Zoom room and then we'll get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for joining us for this month's Carolina Mental Health Seminar, which is Understanding Emotions and How to Talk About Them, as you can see on your screen. I'm Amy Johnson from Student Affairs, and we're so pleased to have a great turnout today for this terrific conversation. A few housekeeping notes right at the start. We have both the chat and the Q&A functions enabled today. But what we'd love is if you have questions, if you would primarily use the Q&A feature as an opportunity to share those. Our facilitator today will be using the chat feature as an opportunity for some interactive questions and response. So that will allow Rachel to be able to read the questions in the chat in response to her prompts and keep those a little bit separate from general questions throughout the session here. So again, thanks so much for your help with that. We're really pleased to have you with us. I wanted to share just a few notes up at the top. We have done a wide series of topics in our mental health seminars series. And in particular, one of the things that we have heard from folks is that they're interested in talking more about our emotions and how to navigate them. And emotions are necessary for problem solving and for motivation. They can also help direct our behavior toward our goals, and they help us connect with and relate to other people. Identifying, discussing, and exploring our emotions in greater detail, including how these emotions make us feel, how they make us think, how they make us behave, can help us gain an important perspective, and they can also increase a sense of control over our lives and minimize stress. So today we're very pleased to have with us our colleague Rachel Rifkin, who is a licensed clinical social worker, who's going to facilitate a conversation about how to understand emotions and how we can talk about them. Rachel is a clinical instructor and psychotherapist at the UNC School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry. She provides clinical services to adults and groups struggling with a variety of issues, including emotion dysregulation. Rachel's philosophy is that therapy should be a safe place where people can express and process their thoughts and feelings. She integrates elements of cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavior therapy into her work with clients. So with that, Rachel, let's turn the Zoom room over to you. And again, our thanks for being with us today and facilitating this important conversation.
Thanks, Amy. It's really good to be here with you all. So I was asked to start by sharing a little bit about why I became a therapist. And I have a pretty simple answer for that. I have just always really been curious about people, curious about why they do the things they do, and wanting to know more about kind of what motivates people. And as a therapist, one of my favorite things to talk about with people is their emotions, as I'm sure you can all imagine. Many people come to therapy with the goal of improving emotion regulation. And the first step in this is having an understanding of our emotions, being aware of why we have emotions, what they do for us, and how to talk about them is incredibly powerful in how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to others, and the world we live in. Throughout the presentation, I have a couple of opportunities to use the chat feature. And actually the first one is now as we go to the next slide. And I should also mention that someone on the other end, Shaya, has been so gracious and has agreed to navigate my slides for me so I can have my notes up. So starting with just an emotion brainstorm, I would love it if people could put into the chat maybe 2 or 3 emotions that either you wish you could experience more, or maybe you'd like to have a little bit more control over. And I'm going to add a challenge to see if maybe you can avoid using happy, sad, mad, or scared. That doesn't mean that I'm not saying that emotions that fall into those categories, just thinking about using words besides those kind of 4 core words. So I see excitement, confidence, caring, joy, suspicious, more control over anger, satisfaction, yes. Yeah, anxiety is a big one. Sadness, depression, overwhelmed. Yeah, so we have a huge sort of breadth of different ways that we can describe our emotional experiences. And it's my hope through our presentation today that we will kind of get to have a better understanding of why we have our emotions, and maybe some different ways to regulate them. So I see lots of really great emotions coming in. Anxiety, boredom, lots of anxiety, yes. Stress, embarrassment, yeah. Frustration, yeah. All right, well, thank you so much. So now that we are kind of in the emotion brain space, I'm going to tell us a little bit about the agenda for today. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about dialectical behavior therapy, which is the modality that I have used that I've drawn on for this presentation today. I want to explain a little bit about what we mean when we talk about emotion regulation and what makes it so hard for us to regulate them. And then I have some skills for acceptance and some skills for change. And those ideas will make more sense once I kind of explain a little bit more about DBT. And then lastly, I want to wrap up with some strategies to help think about how we can reduce our vulnerability to our emotions. So let's start with talking about DBT. So DBT stands for dialectical behavior therapy, and it is a therapeutic modality that's focused on helping people build lives worth living. And it's done through a cognitive behavioral approach with mindfulness components. And I want to spend just a second kind of talking about what each of those are, because it will help us understand the difference between acceptance and change. So CBT is based on CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, is based on the idea that the way people think about things, the way we think about ourselves, the way we think about others, the way we think about the world around us, plays a role in how we feel and how we behave. So if we can help people identify and possibly change some of those thought patterns, then we can help them change emotions and behaviors, right? So if I change the way that I'm thinking, I can interrupt and create different emotions and different behaviors. So there's our change approach, right? Marsha Linehan, who was the creator of DBT, felt that CBT alone wasn't enough to help people build lives worth living. Which is where she started to bring in these mindfulness acceptance approaches. And we're going to talk a little bit more about mindfulness later, but essentially we're talking about living in the present moment with awareness and acceptance. So there's our acceptance approach, right? And this brings us to the idea of dialectics. So a dialectic is 2 seemingly conflicting things that can both be true. Right? So I can accept that emotions are part of life and that I will have them. And I can think about ways to change my responses to them, to change how I express them. So the core dialectic in DBT is acceptance and change. So all of the strategies that we talk about either help us move towards acceptance or they help us move towards change. And often in DBT, we talk about how before I can move towards change, I have to be in a place of acceptance. The other reason that I wanted to highlight the modality that I've used for today is because I do want to just let people know that there are many different theoretical understandings of emotions, and this is just one sort of presentation. I should also say that people who participate in DBT participate in, a weekly therapy where they have many opportunities to practice and learn about these skills. And so what I'm really offering you today is just kind of a snapshot of what that could look like. My hope for today, my big hope is that people just leave with kind of increased awareness of sort of the role that emotions play, and maybe some ideas on how to think about changing them. So if we go to the next slide, so emotion regulation. So what do we mean when we say emotion regulation? So first of all, it's important to know that we are not talking about stopping or getting rid of emotions. Not only would that not be possible, but I wouldn't want that for anyone. As we'll see later, our emotions keep us alive. They help us connect with other people. We need them to live. So we are never thinking about getting rid of or stopping emotions. But when we talk about emotion regulation, we are talking about increasing awareness of our emotions and having more ability to control the emotions that we have, when we have them, and how we experience them. So people who struggle with regulating their emotions, who might have more emotional dysregulation, will notice that maybe emotional dysregulation can lead to saying or doing things that we regret. It can impact our relationships with ourselves, our relationships with others. So the ability to regulate emotions is hugely important for us as humans. All right. So let's talk about why we have emotions. So every emotion, all of the ones that you generated in the chat, exhausted, stressed, joy, satisfied, everything that you guys threw up there, they are all biologically hardwired into our bodies and serve an important function. It's helpful to think of them as another sense. So just like your sense of vision or hearing, they give you information about your environment, helping you to make decisions both consciously and unconsciously. So from a DBT perspective, we think about emotions as motivating us. We think about them as giving us information and helping us to communicate. So some emotions are prompts for action, right? So when I am crossing the street with my child and a car comes racing down, I don't have to stop and think about what I need to do. Fear is going to surge through my body and it's going to motivate me to grab my child and get to safety. So it's kind of like a shortcut. So I don't really have to think things through. Other emotions are giving us information about a situation. If I'm in a job where I am underpaid and overworked, I may feel the emotion of anger, which could be a cue that I need to look for another job or ask for a raise. If I've acted in a way that goes against my values, I may feel the emotion of guilt, which cues me that I need to change my behavior or make a repair. And lastly, our emotions help us communicate with others, right? Through the facial expressions and body language that are associated with each emotion, we communicate with other people what we need, and we can read other people and learn what they need. So our emotions are doing a lot. So if we look at the next slide, so emotions are full system responses. And what I mean by that is that every emotion is accompanied by physiological reactions, thoughts, and urges. Everyone experiences emotions in their own way, right? So the way I experience anxiety could be very different from the way someone else experiences anxiety. However, there is some overlap. So if we look at that first row, situations that might prompt the emotion of anger could be not having things turn out as expected, believing that something is unfair or unjust, And the way that manifests in my body is that I might notice an adrenaline rush. I might notice that my fight or flight response is activated. I might notice an increase in heart rate and breathing, feeling more flushed, noticing muscle tension, and that could be accompanied by the urge to attack. And this action urge piece is important because as we get into the change strategies a little bit later, we're going to see how every emotion has an action urge associated with it. And sometimes it makes sense for me to act on that action urge, and sometimes it doesn't. So I'm not going to read through this entire slide together, but I do want to just kind of point out that there's also a lot of overlap, right? So if we look at fear, the emotion of fear arises in situations where I think I may lose something or someone important, or if my health or well-being is threatened, and it has a very similar physiological reaction to anger. The difference is that the action urge for fear is typically to run away or avoid. So just for a second, let's just recognize how much is happening with every emotion. And then we have to add on that often we're feeling multiple emotions in one situation. So these are really kind of very present for us a lot of the time. So I want to ask, I'm going to take a second and pause, if people could enter into the chat 1 or 2 cues that your body sends you to let you know that you are feeling fear. And maybe it will be similar to what's on the slide, but maybe you have other body reactions that are not on the slide. Heart racing, yep, lots of heart rate, tears, shivering, yes. Yeah. So it's interesting because we can see how there's a lot of overlap, but we can also see how people have their own unique ways of feeling these emotions. Yeah, shaking in your boots. Okay, what about the emotion of happiness? How do you know that you're feeling happy? Noticing the urge to smile, feeling warmth, increased energy, a sense of calm. Yeah, feeling light. I always feel like I notice happiness kind of manifests in my body by sort of an absence of tension or an absence of pressure. So again, we could kind of, I could create a whole nother table on another slide that has, emotions like jealousy and shame and guilt. But this is just kind of a snapshot of what we might be seeing. All right, so I'm going to take us to the next slide. So there are a number of factors that make it difficult for us to regulate our emotions. So the first is actually biology. Research shows that between 15 and 20% of the population are born more emotionally sensitive than others. And when we say emotional sensitivity, what that means is experiencing more intense emotions more frequently, and noticing that those intense emotions last longer. So it takes a little bit longer to kind of come back down to baseline. Lack of skill. So this is one that, we don't really live in a world that teaches us how to regulate emotions. It's not something that's typically taught in schools. And so the way a lot of us learn is through what we see modeled for us growing up. And so if we've never witnessed people effectively regulating, expressing, navigating emotions, then it's going to be really hard for us to know how to do that as well. What's happening in our environment? So this is, stress and job and COVID pandemic and not having, time to prioritize self-care. All of those things are going to impact our ability to regulate our emotions. And the last one is some faulty beliefs about emotions. And these might be beliefs that someone doesn't even really realize that they have, but they're there and they are influencing, expression of emotion and ability to regulate emotion. And we call these emotion myths. So if you go to the next slide, I have some common emotion myths, and this is by no means the only ones. There are probably like maybe 15 of the common ones, but so the belief that it's not good to feel angry, right? I'm not supposed to have the emotion of anger. I'm not supposed to feel sad. Being sad is a sign of weakness. Painful emotions, I can't tolerate them. I have to fix them right away. It's not healthy to express my emotions. So these myths or beliefs can come from a number of different places, right? Some of them are perpetuated by society, right? If we think about society's expectations for men, right? Men are often sent the message that they should be strong, be more emotionally shut down. Some of these could come from cultural backgrounds. Often these are kind of instilled in us at a young age and come from messages we might have received as children. And again, you can see how this kind of ties back in with that lack of skill, right? If I grew up in a household where these myths were already kind of embedded in my parents, then it's easy to see how I can kind of carry them on. So a big goal in DBT is helping people to identify what their own emotion myths are and helping them to come up with alternatives. So if we look at the next slide, right, some goals or some, more effective or healthy counter beliefs, right, could be thinking about reminding myself that anger is a natural emotion and serves a purpose, right? We talked about earlier how every emotion serves a function and is giving us information. Remembering that emotions make us human, right? If I didn't have emotions, then I wouldn't really be able to function. Reminding ourselves that all emotions serve a function and that expressing my emotions in an assertive way is healthy. So this is all not to say that I can't want to learn better ways to express my emotions. I do have to remember, though, that the experience of emotions is just part of being human, right? So I'm not saying that we have to sit with and stay with painful emotions. We can learn skills to cope with them. We can learn skills to decrease them. But having the belief that painful emotions are bad and need to be fixed can be problematic. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. So now we're kind of, right, just to kind of reorient us, we've sort of started talking about why do humans have emotions, why they're so complicated, what makes it hard to regulate them. And now we're kind of making the shift into some of those acceptance strategies. So I mentioned earlier that DBT has a lot of mindfulness components. And often the mindfulness components are where we will find those acceptance strategies. And I know that mindfulness is a huge buzzword right now. And I think that that's both good and problematic. And I think it's problematic in the sense that we don't often really know what it means. It's just kind of thrown around a lot. So when I think of mindfulness, I think of paying attention on purpose to the present moment, non-judgmentally. Right, and all four of those things, sound relatively easy, but they're actually incredibly hard to do, especially when we think about the fact that we do not live in a world that really promotes doing things one at a time and doing things mindfully and intentionally and doing things without judgment. So creating more of a mindfulness practice is a huge endeavor and something that could have a lot of value. Essentially, I think mindfulness is really important when it comes to emotion regulation, because to me, mindfulness is about awareness. And as you can see from some of those previous slides, there is a lot happening with every emotion. And so if I'm not aware of what's happening, if I'm not aware of what's happening in my body, if I'm not aware of what's happening in my mind, then there's really not a lot of room or a lot of space for me to make changes. So this is kind of why my goal for people coming out of the presentation today is really just to have some increased awareness, because that really is the best place to start. So mindfulness is something that can be practiced anywhere, anytime, while doing anything. Some really simple ways to kind of start thinking about building in more of a mindfulness practice could be setting aside a couple of times throughout the day to just sort of sit with yourself for a second, kind of taking a deep breath, noticing what you're feeling, noticing what's happening in your environment, noticing what you're thinking. And it doesn't have to be long, right? A minute or two just to take a breath and check in with yourself. So mindfulness doesn't have to be this big, 30-minute meditation every day. This can be just taking a pause at a couple of moments throughout the day to start noticing what's happening. So validation, if we look at our next slide. So I'm sure that folks are probably familiar with the idea of validation in terms of interpersonal communication. However, self-validation, being able to validate ourselves, is hugely important, particularly when we talk about emotional regulation. And that's because when we validate ourselves, when we validate our emotional experiences, we are communicating a sense of acceptance and understanding. And this does not mean that we end it there, right? It doesn't mean that I say, I understand that I'm angry and I just leave it, right? I can still validate and also move towards change. When we invalidate ourselves, and just to give a little, right, if we tie back into those emotion myths, a lot of those emotion myths that we looked at are really invalidating. I shouldn't have this emotional experience. This is bad. This is wrong. This says something about me that I'm feeling this way, right? So a lot of those emotion myths are really invalidating. And when we invalidate ourselves, it often leads to more intense emotions, which can lead to acting on our emotions in ways that do not serve us. So some ways to think about self-validation, and this is again, right, we can see where that mindfulness piece really ties in, because if I'm not aware of what's happening, it's going to be really hard for me to validate myself. I can sense that I'm feeling anxious. I can sense that my heart is racing. I can sense that I'm nervous about this test that's coming up. I understand that I'm feeling worried about the holidays. I am allowed to experience this emotion. This will pass, but for now, this emotion is here. I think another myth that people have is a fear that if they experience a painful or distressing emotion, it will never go away. If I experience intense sadness or grief, I'm going to be stuck in that forever. And one of the things that DBT teaches us is that no emotion lasts forever. We can sort of think about them like waves, right? They ebb and flow in terms of their intensity. And so that can be really validating for people to remind themselves, yes, I'm feeling a lot of sadness right now, but that doesn't mean that this is forever. It doesn't mean that this degree of sadness or this intensity of sadness will be here forever. So thinking about self-validation is a valuable practice in emotion regulation. So when we go back to some of those emotions that folks entered into the chat at the beginning, right? Boredom, frustration, stress, overwhelm. Let's pause for a second and think about what would it be like to validate for yourselves some of those emotional experiences. Can you validate why you might be having those emotions? And if you're feeling willing, I'd love for people to put some of their validation statements in the chat. So if I scroll up back to the top, lots of nervousness, lots of crying, shiver, or sorry, those are the kind of the sorrow, that was emotion that was mentioned, suspiciousness. Yes, I understand that I'm feeling stressed about my calc exam. I am enough and strong, I can get through this. . Yes, you can do hard things. So our beautiful validation statements. These are great. And again, this doesn't mean that we have to sit with these emotions. It doesn't mean we have to stay with them. We have to validate before we can move towards change, right? There's that dialectic again of acceptance and change. Okay, so whenever you're ready to next slide. All right, so now that I have just hyped everyone up on the fact that our emotions are biologically hardwired and we don't have a lot of control over them, I'm going to kind of take a step back and say that this does not mean that they are always giving us the most accurate information, right? So on the previous slides, we talked about examples of, how fear, anger, sadness can all be kind of these shortcuts that happen, instantaneously. An event happens, I'm driving and someone cuts me off and I feel the emotion of fear, and that prompts me to kind of turn my wheel so that I don't get into a collision. And those are all justified and valid, and we want to sort of honor those action urges. At the same time, there are also plenty of instances where our emotions are being influenced by our interpretations. So if you look at this hand, so this actually comes from a DBT therapist in the triangle area. And this is a really beautiful kind of like helpful visual of how we can analyze an emotion. So, right, an event happens, something happens either internally or externally. I have assumptions and interpretations and judgments about that event, which is the story. That influences the emotion I feel, which then, right, then we have those accompanying physiological changes and action urges. And in the palm is vulnerability and resilience factors. So vulnerability, an example of that could be maybe I'm one of those people who falls in the 15 to 20%. That's just a little bit more emotionally sensitive. Resilience factors could be maybe, I have awareness of that and I have a really strong, mindfulness practice. And so I can be kind of in tune with what's happening in my mind and my body. Other resilience factors could be having strong support network, having really good coping skills in place. But this story piece, right, in the pointer finger, this is oftentimes playing a big role in the emotions that we're feeling, and it's not accurate information. So, and now we're kind of moving into those change strategies. So if you go to the next slide, here's kind of another way to look at this. So this is actually called, and this is kind of a poor representation, I didn't do a great job creating this, but this is called the cognitive triangle. So again, right, a situation happens. I have thoughts about that situation. I have assumptions, I have interpretations, and these are quick, right? Our thoughts are pretty instantaneous. We don't even really realize we're having them. And then those thoughts and interpretations and assumptions lead to certain emotions and then influence my behavior. So when I was talking earlier about how in CBT, we try to make changes in one of these 3 points on the triangle, right? So if I can start to identify what types of thoughts I might be having and how those thoughts might be influencing my emotions and my behaviors, then maybe I can start making some changes. And again, just to reiterate, when we talk about a situation, we are talking about something that can be internal or external, right? So an internal event could be, I wake up tomorrow and I have intense pressure in my chest. And my thought, my interpretation of that is I'm having a heart attack. I have to call 911. Right? And so then my emotion is fear and my behavior is, right, and I go and get help. So that's sort of an internal situation. And then all day long, right, we're encountering more external situations. I find out I have a test. I am running late in the morning. I get into an argument with my husband, right? All day long, things are happening to us and we're having thoughts about those things. And a big reminder, or something that's really worth keeping in mind, is that our thoughts and feelings are not facts. A lot of people have a tendency, right, first of all, to not even really be aware of what they're thinking, but to also not be able to question those thoughts. And so as we kind of go through, I think we're going to see that oftentimes these thoughts that we're having are influencing our emotions in a way that's not actually accurate. Excuse me. So if we look at the next slide, so this is a skill from DBT. It's called check the facts. And typically when we look at check the facts, we don't really think about the behavior piece, but I really wanted to include that since we are talking about the action urges associated with each emotion. But this is, right, just kind of that cognitive triangle that we saw on the previous slide, just kind of written out in a different format. So a situation happens. I receive an email from my boss at 4 o'clock on Friday asking for a meeting on Monday. And I'm sure that there are lots of ways that people could think about this, but given the sort of more anxious person that I tend to be, my thoughts are going to be, I'm in trouble. I'm probably going to get fired. They weren't happy with the work that I did. I'll never get another job. Before I know it, I'm going to be, without a house. And those thoughts, that interpretation, brings emotions like fear and dread, right? And we have all of those physiological symptoms that accompany those emotions. And then my behaviors, maybe I ruminate all weekend, right? Maybe I think all weekend about, oh, this meeting is going to be terrible. I don't want to hear what he has to say. Maybe I'm more irritable with my family. And so we really want to kind of hone in on this interpretation piece and ask ourselves a couple of questions. Is this a true thought? Is this a helpful thought? Is this likely? Am I making assumptions? And this is not the only way this could look, right? I'm sure that maybe other people might think, I'm getting a raise. He's so happy with the work I did. And that could influence, right? And then we would see how that influences totally different emotions and behaviors. So the skill of check the facts is all about this interpretation piece. So if we look at the next slide, right, the situation stays the same. I still receive an email from my boss at 4 o'clock on a Friday asking me for a meeting on Monday. When I use check the facts, I'm really asking myself, what do I really know? What are the actual facts about the situation? And really the only thing I know is that he wants to meet on Monday. And I have a choice of what I do with that, right? I can kind of let that consume me all weekend and ruminate about it and worry about it. Or I can remind myself that I don't know and I don't really have any control over that. And I can be intentional with how I focus my energies over the weekend. And in terms of how that changes the emotion, right? Maybe there's still a little bit of anxiety, but maybe it's come down in intensity. So that's kind of the goal with check the facts, is thinking through, what am I thinking and how are those thoughts either creating an emotion that is not consistent with the situation or creating an intensity that isn't consistent with the situation. Right, so another example could be, driving down the highway and somebody cuts me off. And my thoughts are, how dare he do that? He did that on purpose. And I feel this surge of anger, and, maybe my urge is to, speed up and cut them off. And I've made a lot of assumptions and interpretations, right? I have no idea what's going on for that other person. And often we'll find that the thoughts can fall into different patterns of thinking. So we call these cognitive distortions. So catastrophizing, mind reading, fortune telling. Those are some of the more common cognitive distortions that people will fall into. And we'll see that those really kind of fuel those big, intense emotions. So again, generally the questions that we want to ask ourselves is what I'm thinking true? And is what I'm thinking helpful? And if the answer to either of those is no, then we want to think about how can I be more factual about this situation? So let me pause for a second and see if anybody has any questions. Any questions about check the facts? Do people identify with this idea of kind of catastrophizing or mind reading or fortune telling, noticing a tendency to go more negative when events happen? Oh, this is a really good question. How can you remember to check the facts when you start to spiral? So this is where that awareness piece comes in, right? The more that I can kind of create awareness to what is happening in my body and in my mind, the more opportunity there is to create a pause. So DBT offers a whole set of other skills that we're not even talking about today, called distress tolerance skills. And those are skills that I can use when my emotional distress is so high that tapping into that more rational thinking is not really available, right? Because that physiological response has really taken over. So examples of some distress tolerance skills are using deep breathing, right? Which I know I'm sure everyone hears about that a lot, but taking deep intentional breaths actually does activate our parasympathetic nervous system, which is part of the nervous system that promotes rest and relaxation. Putting cold water on our face is another sort of skill that has the potential to kind of change what's happening for me physiologically. But this is hard. This is something that comes up a lot in therapy, is how am I supposed to use these skills when my emotional intensity is so high? So some things that like I always go to distress tolerance, always kind of reinforcing the importance of building in that mindfulness practice. I would also say starting to practice these things when you're more emotionally regulated, right? If I were to take a moment right now and think back on a time over the last week when I noticed some really intense anxiety, can I sit in this moment when that intensity is not so high and think back through to what was happening? What was going on in my environment? What types of things might I have been thinking about? How might those thoughts have been influencing that intense anxiety? And kind of sit down in the moment and sort of check the facts on it. And to also just validate that it's hard. When our emotional intensity is really high, it is very hard to kind of tap into that more rational thinking. There are definitely ways to navigate that. I hope that was helpful, Molly. Any other questions? I'm going to give it like 2 more seconds, and then I'm going to keep going. Okay. Well, if we go to the next slide. So here is kind of our next change strategy. So this is called opposite action. So we've already talked about how every emotion has an accompanying action urge. And there will be times in your life when acting on that action urge is totally appropriate. There will also be times when acting on that action urge is unhelpful. And usually the reason we are having that action urge is because of what's happening with the thoughts, right? So if I think about myself and getting ready for this presentation, automatic thoughts, I'm going to do terribly. I'm an awful public speaker. This is going to be humiliating. I feel anxious, I feel dread, I have that pit in my stomach, my muscles are tense, my heart is beating, my breath is more shallow. And we can think about how that might impact my behaviors, right? I might ruminate about it. I might avoid preparing for this presentation. Avoidance is a huge way that people are regulating their emotion, right? Which, and again, not really regulating them in an effective way, but regulating them in a way to kind of get away from them. But avoidance is a huge sort of thing that comes up a lot in therapy. And that, when we think back to that chart we looked at earlier, the action urge with fear is to avoid, to withdraw, to flee. However, in this situation, this emotion doesn't match the situation. The intensity of this emotion doesn't match. If I were to kind of act on this urge, then their consequences are going to be even greater for me, because then I'm going to have this presentation that I'm not ready for. And so opposite action is the skill of being able to sort of discern when my action urge is appropriate and helpful and when it's not. And when it's not, I practice opposite action. So again, the same situation, I'm preparing for a presentation at work. I can totally validate for myself that public speaking is hard and it's nerve-wracking. And I can also see it's a good opportunity for me to try things that are outside of my comfort zone. I do love to talk about emotions, right? I do it all the time in therapy with other people. So how is this thought process impacted, right? Well, maybe I still have a little bit of anxiety, but it's come down in intensity. And there's also a little bit more excitement, right? I'm looking forward to something. And so then how do I want to act opposite? Validate myself and gently approach preparing for the presentation. So other examples of opposite action, this actually comes up a lot for people who are struggling with depression. The action urge for sadness is often to withdraw or isolate. And so for people who are struggling with depression, right, they isolate from friends and family, they stop engaging in activities that they used to enjoy. They stop answering the phone, they stop taking care of themselves. And so all of those sort of behaviors end up reinforcing the feelings of sadness and the thoughts that are accompanying sadness. So for people struggling with depression, we talk about opposite action a lot, right? Thinking about what are ways that I can slowly build back in those activities so that I can start increasing those positive emotions again. So I want to pause again and just see if there's any questions, because just as, again, a kind of a bird's eye view, right? We started by talking about what are emotions? Why do we have them? What are some acceptance strategies that we can use? What are some change strategies? And now we're getting into talking about how to reduce our vulnerability to emotion mind. So any questions on the change strategies or the acceptance strategies? Okay, all right, I'm going to carry us on. So this brings us to the please skill. So if anyone's familiar with DBT, they will probably know that DBT loves acronyms. There are lots and lots and lots of acronyms in DBT. And this is the one that we use to think about how to reduce our vulnerability to our emotions. So, and this really kind of ties back into self-care. How are we taking care of ourselves? How are we spending our time? So making sure that we're treating physical illness. If I'm sick, am I going to the doctor? Am I taking medication as prescribed? If I'm sick, am I using PTO? Am I giving my body an opportunity to rest? Thinking about my eating. Am I getting enough food? Am I getting a good balance of veggies and fruits and all of the things that we're supposed to have? You know, this is a big one for me. I notice the busier my schedule is, the more likely I am to skip lunch. And on those days, I notice that at the end of the day, I'm a little bit more likely to be dysregulated. Avoiding mood altering substances. So thinking about how alcohol impacts my mood. Actually, this is big when people come into therapy with anxiety. We talk a lot about how alcohol actually serves to increase anxiety. People always think that it's a depressant, but it actually kind of makes anxiety worse. Sleep is huge. Everybody needs different, I think some people need more sleep. I'm somebody who needs a lot of sleep. But thinking about what are some good sleep hygiene practices? If your sleep is really poor right now, what are some things that you might want to do? So we talk a lot about getting on a regular sleep schedule. We talk a lot about reducing screen time before bed. Our beds should only be used for sleep and sex. A lot of people tend to spend a lot of time in their bed reading or doing notes for school. And the more time we spend in our beds, the more we're kind of throwing off that sleep cycle. Some other big sleep hygiene strategies are to avoid caffeine before bed, avoid exercise before bed, get regular exercise. There is a ton of research about the link between exercise and reduced symptoms of depression. So all of these factors play a role in, right, if we go back to that palm, right, we talked about the resilience and vulnerability factors. If I'm taking really poor care of my body, then that's going to make me more vulnerable to my emotions. It's going to make those intense emotions, I'm going to be more susceptible to them. Other things to think about here are you engaging in activities that you enjoy? Another thing that DBT talks about is the importance of engaging in positive activities. It sounds like there are a lot of students here, and I think when you're a student, it's easy to kind of throw yourself into school and become so consumed by school and kind of let the other parts of your life kind of fall to the side. And really, humans need connection. We need to be connected with other people. We need to be doing things we enjoy. So really thinking about how do I promote more balance, right? Which again, as another dialectic, I need to be doing schoolwork and I need to be studying and doing what I need to do for that. And how do I find time to do things I enjoy? How do I find time to be outside? So when I think about the please skill, right, I'm not only thinking about treating my physical body, but I'm thinking about treating like my, spiritual body. I'm trying to think about how am I connecting with other people. So these are all ways to think about reducing vulnerability to our emotions. So I think I see a question. So exercise before bed. So I think on the sleep hygiene ones, I want to say that these are very, I have met plenty of people that can exercise right before bed and have no problem, an hour later lying down to go to sleep. So maybe that one doesn't resonate with you, but there are people, right, that when we exercise, we're kind of getting all of those endorphins and those good hormones going in our body, and those can be kind of activating and uplifting, and it can make it a little bit harder then to lie down and go to sleep. But the sleep hygiene stuff is really individual. If you feel like your sleep is fine, you're getting a good 8 hours, you don't have problems staying asleep, then maybe you don't need to make any changes to your sleep hygiene. On the other hand, if you feel like, sleep is poor, pretty disrupted, then it might be worth it to think through, what does this look like and what changes might I want to make? Some people say not to eat several hours. So again, that's individual. I can eat before bed and I have no problem going to sleep. Then my husband is somebody who it really disrupts his sleep. So I think you really have to sort of check in with yourself and see what works for you and what doesn't. So reading in bed before bed, I think is okay. I'm thinking more about, people who spend lots of time in the Sarah, I just saw something pop up. Anyway, so I did see a question about books. So that is actually sort of my next slide. So these are a couple of my favorite DBT resources. So this book by Sherry Van Dyke, I think is how you say her name, Calming the Emotional Storm, is excellent. It is pretty brief. She does a really amazing job giving an overview of DBT. I love this book. The Miracle of Mindfulness by Thich Nhat Hanh is a really great introduction to creating a mindfulness practice and building a life worth living. So Marsha Linehan, the woman who created DBT, recently wrote her memoir, and she talks about her life as an emotionally sensitive person and how that was a huge motivator for her in terms of creating this therapeutic modality that is now, there's tons of evidence behind it. It's, I'm curious, that is a question I have. I'm curious if people in the audience have heard of DBT. Is that something that people are familiar with? So I see yes. Yeah. There's a no, I have not, somewhat. Yeah, so DBT, and it's hard for me to know, right, because I'm a therapist, so I never know, is it just because I'm a therapist that I hear about this all the time? But DBT is really kind of becoming a huge request that people have. There's a lot of research that suggests it can be hugely helpful for people who struggle to regulate their emotions. I've also heard it referred to as like life skills training. I mean, DBT presents information on material that all of us need to know, and many of us have not really been taught. How to navigate relationships, how to regulate our emotions, how to communicate effectively. So DBT is, I mean, obviously I'm a little bit biased, but I think it's a great thing to have. Those DBT skills can be great to have in your toolbox. So this is what I have. Any questions or concerns that folks have?
Thanks so much, Rachel. This has really been terrific. We have now reached the sort of last 30 minutes of our session today and have the Q&A open for any questions that you may have. We encourage folks to put them in there so that we can answer them, or other folks can see them as well. That would be particularly helpful to us. Rachel, maybe just while we get started, I know we received a couple of items prior to the session. And the first one is there any advice that you would give to someone who is hesitant to take that first step in reaching out, for instance, to speaking to a therapist or pursuing some sort of counseling or additional support? Any guidance you can offer to get somebody over that hump?
Yeah, so I would say that just to validate that it is scary to think about the prospect of going to someone you've never met and talking about things that are deeply personal and maybe you've never shared with anyone. I think that it can also be hugely valuable. I've seen a lot of really positive change from people who've engaged in therapy. I do recommend that people do not be afraid to interview a potential therapist. There's a resource called psychologytoday.com, and it is sort of like this master, I don't know, I guess it's a place where therapists can kind of post their profiles, and it's really nice because you can filter by insurance, you can filter by location, you can filter by like what therapeutic modality you're looking for. And I really encourage people to like call people and ask them, how do you practice therapy? What is it that you think you can offer me? Because I think that's something that gets in the way for people, is that it feels so scary and it's something that we end up avoiding. So my advice would be to give it a chance, and you might be surprised.
I think that's terrific advice. One other piece that I also often talk with students about is to remember that this is your experience, and it is appropriate that you go in with a set of goals and objectives that you want to accomplish. So to actually think about what is it that I would want to get out of a counseling experience, and open the conversation with the counselor as you described with that in mind, and how can you help me with these things, and really understand that you have an important ownership role in this conversation. I know so many times students feel as though they're the sort of indirect recipient, but it's really to take an active role in that and to consider it yours can often be very helpful. It's really great.
Can I add oh, sorry. I was just going to add, I think the pandemic has actually really revealed a lot of need for therapy. I think it has, people struggled so much and they kind of felt pushed to a point where they didn't have a, they felt maybe like they didn't have a choice anymore. And so it's really opened up a lot of awareness around mental health in a way that I hope sticks, and that I hope we can continue to be having these conversations. So I would just add that I think COVID has kind of maybe made it more okay to recognize that we need a little bit more support.
I think that's absolutely right. And that's something that we're trying to do with these seminars and other sessions, is to make sure that we're talking about mental health and our mental health and well-being in a very intentional, deliberate, day-to-day way, to take away some of the stigma, to encourage help-seeking behavior. I think that really is true. Well, in the meantime, I'm thrilled that we have a number of good questions in the Q&A, and I don't know if you can see them. The first one is, how could I get involved in making others aware of DBT? Specific guidance you have?
Oh, that is a great question. I guess my first thought is, like, if there are skills that really resonate for you, sharing them with family and friends. I mean, that's actually one of the things I love about therapy, is I think it's a way to sort of see change trickle out, right? When you meet with someone individually and they learn new skills to cope with emotions, they learn that some of the beliefs that they were holding on to were maybe not true, and they, take those into like their relationships with their friends and family, and you can sort of see this change kind of happen. So I would say if there are skills in DBT that really resonate with you, and you see the way they might help somebody else, sharing it with them.
Great. Somebody had written about the Calming the Emotional Storm book and is curious to start reading it. They also want to know what your favorite thing is about that book. Can you guide them to any particular elements or pieces that were your faves?
Well, I'll say, for those who are familiar with DBT, I actually have the DBT skills training manual here. So it is a monster manual. DBT is a very structured treatment. Typically, people who are doing comprehensive DBT participate in a skills training group and individual therapy. And it's a lot. It's almost like its own language. I've been, taking training in DBT for probably 5 years now, and I still feel like I'm always learning new things. What I really liked about this book is that she really knows how to distill this stuff down into bite-sized pieces that are clear. Like, it is, I'm sorry, I feel like I really rave about it. It's very well written, but I would think that's my favorite thing about it. It just takes something that is very complex and kind of simplifies it and makes it very user-friendly.
That's great. I love this next question because it touches on something that I come across regularly in my work too. So the individual says, I was in therapy and tended to feel like it was a good outlet, but it didn't affect any change in my life or help me overcome issues I was struggling with. Should I look for someone who will engage in active dialogue instead of simply listening to me?
That is a great question. And I think that's something that comes up a lot. So this is kind of when I go back to, when you are looking for a potential therapist, not being afraid to ask some of those questions. What type of therapy do you do? Are you going to be a therapist who mostly just listens to me and lets me vent? Or are you going to be able to actually give me suggestions and guidance? Because there are therapists out there that are more, process oriented, and, that's kind of their jam. And but that's not for everybody. So I think if you are interested in pursuing therapy again, I would encourage you to just be really transparent with a potential therapist about what you're looking for.
I think that's so important. And again, this goes to sort of owning your experience. I wish I had a nickel for the number of students in particular who tell me, I went to a counseling session one time and I didn't like the person. It just didn't work out. It wasn't a good fit. So counseling is not for me. And, it's interesting. We would not think twice about, and I don't mean this unkindly to any hairdressers or barbers out there, but we wouldn't think twice about ditching a hairdresser or a barber or somebody that we felt like didn't do our hair correctly. But there is an assumption that I think many of us make when we go to get medical care, and particularly mental health care, that it's not for me because I went to a session and it didn't work out, or I didn't like, I just didn't have a connection with that person. Getting a connection with, your therapist or your counselor or any kind of medical provider is critical. And if you don't have it with that one person, by all means, keep looking. It's okay.
And I would say it takes a little while, right? Like I generally, when people come to me, I always preface it by saying that there are many, many, many therapists in the world and everybody does things their own way. And if I'm not the one for you, then let me know so I can help you find someone who is. And it takes a little while to build a relationship. So sometimes it's worth it to give it, a couple of sessions to see if maybe there's something that can develop there.
Really helpful. Another individual wrote, if you have a friend that always comes to you with their emotions and they don't want to see a therapist, how can I effectively help them without being overbearing?
This is a good one because this takes me back to some of those emotion myths. So some of the ones I didn't include, but a lot of people have the belief that it's their job to fix other people's emotions, or the belief I can't tolerate it if someone I care about is in discomfort. And so sometimes a goal in therapy is working to recognize that that's not within your control. And your job is really to be able to manage your own emotions. So I would say that you can really validate that friend and you can offer what suggestions or guidance you have. And then it's up to them to kind of decide what they want to do with that.
Helpful. We have another question here that says, would it be okay to look into therapy not only as a personal outlet, but as a resource to explore the career since I am interested in it?
I think so. I mean, when I was in graduate school, we were required to go to therapy. I think it's a beautiful opportunity to explore what stuff you might be bringing to the career. And I think a lot of us learn about the type of therapist that we might want to be from therapists that we've had.
I feel pretty comfortable saying too, after working in higher education for more than 25 years and certainly working closely with our team of counselors over in CAPS, this is one of the reasons why many of us are in a higher education environment as opposed to some other environment. We appreciate participating as a part of this community. We understand the work that we're doing is both support and resources and learning focused. And so I feel pretty comfortable in saying too that any of my colleagues over at CAPS would be glad to talk with students who think they might be interested in this role as a career and find out, what educational preparation do I need to do? What's the job really like on a day-to-day basis? So I think that this is something that, again, for those of us who work in higher education, we're all about this and happy to connect with students who just have questions about how can I get connected, help me think about whether or not this is the right fit for me, possibly. Another question, Rachel, is I want to go back to therapy, but I don't know where I even want to start in terms of self-work. Oh, do I need to have an action plan? This is good because I certainly didn't want to dissuade anybody from saying that you have to come in with a plan. If you don't have a plan, it's okay, right?
Oh, yes, that is totally true. Actually, a lot of people come to therapy with pretty broad goals, right? So you can come in with something really specific, or you could be, maybe it would just be nice to have someone to kind of process some stuff with, and that's totally fine too.
Good. Thank you for that question. That was really helpful. How can you use DBT to build a romantic relationship is another question in the Q&A.
So DBT actually does have an answer for that. So I should give a little bit of context. So DBT is broken up into 4 modules. So we have our mindfulness skills, which we kind of talked about. We have distress tolerance skills. So those are skills we can use when emotional distress is so high, right? And when emotional distress is so high, that's when people tend to engage in behaviors that are problematic, right? We have emotion regulation as a module, which we kind of hit on some of those today. And then the fourth one is interpersonal effectiveness. So those are all the skills about learning how to communicate more assertively, more directly, learning how to build relationships with people, learning how to seek out relationships. The interpersonal effectiveness module actually has another really great set of interpersonal effectiveness myths, right? So again, some beliefs that get in the way of people's ability to have sort of like deep, meaningful relationships and connection. So, I mean, I don't know how to answer that very succinctly, but I would say that there are skills in DBT that can help people to increase the likelihood of finding meaningful romantic relationships. And actually, I think there might be a chapter in this book on it. Sorry, let me just check really quickly. Yeah, her last chapter is improving your relationships. So again, just another plug.
This session could be helpful on so many levels. Could find you a partner. That's amazing. All right. Are there any other questions? I think we'll talk briefly about the recording and a couple of housekeeping issues, but does anyone else have any sort of final questions? And while we're waiting for those to come in, Rachel, thank you again for this session. Do you have any sort of final thoughts or parting advice for us as we go off to put these skills into good use?
Just remembering the importance of validation. We as humans have a tendency to be pretty critical and harsh to ourselves, and there is great value to meeting ourselves with kindness and compassion, and that can actually open up a lot of room for change.
That's great. Oh, and in the meantime, we do have a final question here. How would you recommend people manage emotions for folks with ADD or similar neurodivergence?
So that's a great question, and one I actually do not feel equipped to answer. I do not have a lot of training in ADHD or neurodivergence. So I would encourage you to if you were looking for a provider, if you were to look at that Psychology Today website, I'm pretty sure that they have an option that you can filter for looking for resources associated with that.
And you know what we can also do? We could consult with our colleagues maybe over in CAPS and see if they might have, or Department of Psychiatry, and see if they might have any recommendations regarding good resources for that. So we'll take
That's a great idea.
Follow-up item. I think that was, I believe we still have that question answered in the Q&A. So that's really appreciate that. We'll see if we can do a follow-up, little homework on that piece. Well, thank you everybody so much for joining us today. A few just quick housekeeping issues before we close off. One, this session was recorded today. We will have the recording available up on our Heals Care Network website for you. Two, I know many folks have expressed a desire to have the QR code. So hopefully there it is through the magic of television, the QR code available to you. And we will also make sure that that is posted and available for folks post session if for whatever reason you're having difficulty accessing that right now. In addition, again, a huge thank you to Rachel Rifkin for a really wonderful session today. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and wisdom with us. We hope we can maybe invite you back to do another session. This has been a great conversation today. Also would very much like to shout out our fantastic team behind the scenes, and Sarah Stallman and Allison Reed and Ashaya Campbell. Thank you for always making this go off without a hitch and look so easy. We are indebted to you. A couple of other notes. If you are interested in more discussions about mental health, we do have a number of sessions coming up this week. We have a Healing Forward Intimacy After Trauma for BIPOC students session coming up through our multicultural health program at CAPS. That is available, and all of these events are available through the care.unc.edu calendar for the Heals Care Network, so check it out. And then there are 2 coming up tomorrow. We have our mental health roundtable through the undergraduate executive branch, and a session called No More Lonely Tar Heels Speed Friending. That is also available tomorrow evening. So I hope you'll check those out. And then this is our final seminar of the calendar year this year, because Thanksgiving is next week, and finals will be here before we know it. So we are holding on any further programming to allow folks to focus in on finals. We know that the holiday time and finals period can be a time of high stress for folks. So we encourage you to please continue to seek out resources, check for events and programming, refer folks through the Heals Care Network site at care.unc.edu, and know that we do have more seminars coming up next semester. We have one in February called How to Foster Happiness, and one in March called How to Focus When Focusing is Difficult. So thank you again, everybody, so much for joining us today. All the best. Have a great end of the semester and a happy holiday season for those of you who celebrate. We will look forward to seeing you in the new year. Take good care.